Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button because we're about to dive into some seriously bizarre history that'll hopefully lull you right into dreamland. Tonight, we're talking about something you probably never thought to wonder about, how medieval people actually slept. And spoiler alert, it was weird, like really weird. So dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's drift back about 700 years to see how our ancestors spent their nights. Trust me, by the end of this, you'll appreciate your memory foam mattress a whole lot more. So picture this. It's the year 1300-something, you're a regular person living in medieval Europe, and the sun just went down. What do? Well, if you're thinking climb into bed and sleep for 8 hours straight, congratulations, you're completely wrong. Because that whole 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep thing, total modern invention. Medieval people didn't sleep like that at all. They had this thing called biphasic sleep, which is just a fancy way of saying they slept in two separate chunks. And no, this wasn't because they had insomnia or were binge-watching medieval Netflix. This was just how everyone slept, and they thought it was totally normal. Here's how it worked. You'd go to bed pretty much right after sunset because what else were you going to do? Candles were expensive, torches were smoky, and nobody had invented electricity yet, obviously. So you'd crash around 8 or 9 p.m., sleep for about 4 hours, and then, and this is the weird part, you'd wake up on purpose. Around midnight or 1 a.m., you'd just naturally wake up, and instead of panicking about it like we do now, you'd get up and do stuff. Medieval people called this the watching period, or first waking, and it was considered prime time for all sorts of activities. We're talking prayer, sex, visiting neighbors, doing light chores, reading if you were rich enough to own books, or just lying there thinking about your life choices. Apparently, this was also when people had their most vivid thoughts and did their deepest thinking. Philosophers and writers would use this time to work on their ideas, because I guess nothing gets the creative juices flowing like waking up in the pitch-black medieval night. Then, after an hour or two of this midnight productivity session, you'd go back to bed for your second sleep, which would last until sunrise. And boom, that was your night. 2 sleeps, with a weird little intermission in between. The truly wild part? This wasn't considered strange or unhealthy. It was just normal. Historical records from the medieval period are filled with references to first sleep and second sleep, and nobody seemed to think it was a big deal. It was only after the Industrial Revolution, when people had to wake up at specific times for factory work and we invented better lighting, that we all started sleeping in one continuous block. So basically, our modern sleep schedule is the weird one, historically speaking. Now let's talk about where medieval people were sleeping, because the beds themselves were a whole situation. If you were a peasant, and statistically you probably were, your bed was basically a pile of straw or dried leaves on the floor, maybe with a rough cloth or animal skin thrown over it if you were lucky. You'd share this charming sleeping arrangement with your entire family, plus possibly some livestock, because why not keep the cows and chickens inside where it's warm? The smell must have been absolutely delightful. I'm sure everyone woke up feeling refreshed and not at all covered in bug bites and animal droppings. Wealthy people, of course, had actual bed frames, but even those were pretty uncomfortable by our standards. Mattresses were stuffed with straw, wool, or feathers if you were really fancy, and they'd get lumpy and disgusting pretty quickly. You couldn't just throw them in the washing machine, so they'd accumulate all sorts of delightful things like dust mites, fleas, bedbugs, and probably some mold for good measure. People would try to combat the bug situation by stuffing their mattresses with herbs like lavender or rosemary, which smell nice but don't actually stop bugs from eating you alive. But hey, at least you'd smell vaguely pleasant while being devoured by insects. The really wealthy folks had these massive canopy beds with heavy curtains all around them, which served multiple purposes. First, they provided privacy because, remember, even rich people often slept in rooms with other people. Privacy wasn't really a thing in medieval times. Second, the curtains helped keep you warm because medieval castles were basically giant stone refrigerators. No central heating, just some sad little fireplaces that barely put a dent in the cold. And third, the curtains were supposed to protect you from all the things people believed came out at night. We'll get to that in a minute, because medieval people had some truly wild beliefs about nighttime and sleep. Because of course they did. Sleep was considered a dangerous, liminal state where your soul was kind of loose in your body and vulnerable to attack. People believed that demons, witches, and all sorts of nasty creatures came out at night specifically to mess with sleeping people. There was this widespread belief in something called the nightmare. And yeah, that's where we get the word nightmare from. But originally, the mare was an actual demon that would sit on your chest while you sleep and suffocate you. If you've ever had sleep paralysis, where you wake up but can't move and feel like there's pressure on your chest, that's what medieval people were describing, except they thought it was a literal demon trying to kill them, which honestly makes sleep paralysis even more terrifying. To protect themselves from these nocturnal demons, people would do all sorts of things. They'd hang bunches of herbs over their beds, draw protective symbols on the walls, say prayers before sleeping, and keep religious relics nearby. Some people would sleep with a piece of bread under their pillow because apparently demons hate carbs. Who knew? Wealthy people would have priests bless their bedrooms, and some would even have a servant stay awake all night to keep watch for evil spirits. Imagine that being your job, professional night demon spotter. There was also this belief that you should never wake someone up suddenly, because their soul might not have time to get back into their body properly, and they'd go insane or die. So if you needed to wake someone up in medieval times, you were supposed to do it very gently and gradually, giving their soul time to settle back in. This is actually kind of sweet in a weird, superstitious way. Like, hey, give your soul a minute to get back from wherever it's been wandering.
Sleep-talking and sleepwalking were considered signs of possession or witchcraft. If you were caught sleepwalking, you might literally be accused of being a witch and have a very bad time. People who talked in their sleep were thought to be communicating with demons or revealing secrets that evil forces had extracted from them. So basically, if you had any kind of sleep disorder in medieval times, you were screwed. Just fully screwed. Let's float over to the topic of sleeping arrangements, because this gets messy. As I mentioned, privacy was not a thing. Even in wealthy households, multiple people would share a room, and sometimes even a bed. It wasn't uncommon for children, parents, grandparents, and maybe a servant or two to all pile into one bed. Entire families sleeping in one pile, like a litter of puppies, except way less cute and way more awkward. When travelers stayed at inns, they'd often have to share beds with complete strangers. You'd pay for a spot in a bed, not a whole bed to yourself, and you might end up sleeping next to some random dude who smelled like he hadn't bathed in 6 months. Because he probably hadn't. Bathing was considered medically dangerous in medieval times. People thought it would open your pores and let disease in. So everyone was just marinating in their own filth, and then they'd all pile into communal beds at inns. The thought of the sheets at a medieval inn is genuinely nightmare-inducing. Actually, they probably didn't have sheets, just a blanket that hadn't been washed since the inn opened in 1347. Servants in wealthy households often slept on the floor outside their master bedroom door, or sometimes right in the room on a little pallet. This was partly for convenience. If the lord or lady needed something in the night, the servant was right there. But also for security. You'd have a servant sleeping literally in your room to make sure nobody murdered you in your sleep. Because that was a real concern people had. Medieval times were dangerous, and assassination was a genuine occupational hazard if you were important enough. Children, meanwhile, were often sent to sleep in separate rooms once they were past infancy, sometimes watched over by a nurse or servant, but infant mortality was so high that parents couldn't get too attached, which is just incredibly depressing. There are records of parents being advised not to sleep with their infants because overlaying, accidentally rolling over and smothering your baby, was tragically common. Some areas even had laws about it, with punishments for mothers who accidentally killed their babies this way. It was grim, guys, really grim. Now let's talk about what people wore to bed, because even pajamas were weird in medieval times. Poor people basically just slept in their underwear, which was a long shirt called a chemise for women or a shirt for men. These were made of rough linen or wool and would get progressively more disgusting over time because, again, Washing clothes was a huge production. You couldn't just toss them in a machine. You had to heat water over a fire, use harsh soap made from animal fat and lye, and scrub everything by hand. So, people didn't wash their undergarments very often, and they'd sleep in the same clothes they'd been wearing all day, which had soaked up all their sweat and whatever else they'd gotten on them. Rich people had special sleeping shirts that were a bit nicer, made of finer linen or even silk if you were really wealthy. But the basic concept was the same. You slept in what was essentially a long nightshirt, and you didn't take it off. The idea of sleeping naked was considered scandalous and improper. Even married couples were supposed to keep their nightshirts on with special slits for marital activities, because God forbid anyone be fully naked, even in the privacy of their own bed. People would also wear nightcaps to bed, which served a practical purpose. Bedrooms were freezing, and a lot of your body heat escapes through your head, so wearing a cap helped keep you warm. Plus, it kept your hair somewhat clean, or at least contained, since you weren't washing it very often either. Women would braid their hair before bed to keep it from getting tangled, and then cover it with a cap. The whole nighttime routine was way more complicated than you'd think, considering they didn't have running water or mirrors or any of the things we take for granted. Here's another fun fact. Medieval people believed that certain sleeping positions could affect your personality and health. Sleeping on your right side was considered the healthiest position because it supposedly aided digestion and kept your heart safe. Sleeping on your left side was thought to be dangerous because your heart was on that side and you might somehow crush it or slow it down. Sleeping on your stomach was considered the worst position of all. It was associated with gluttony and lust, and people thought it would give you nightmares and impure thoughts. So, yeah, even your sleeping position was morally judged in medieval times. Dreams themselves were taken incredibly seriously. People believed dreams were messages from God, prophecies of the future, or warnings about danger. If you had a vivid dream, you'd probably tell everyone about it and try to interpret what it meant. There were whole books dedicated to dream interpretation, listing symbols and what they supposedly meant. Dreaming about teeth falling out? Bad omen. Dreaming about water? Could mean a bunch of different things depending on whether it was clear or murky. Dreaming about animals? Each animal had a specific meaning. It was like medieval astrology, but for your subconscious. Nightmares, as I mentioned, were thought to be caused by demons, but they could also be a sign that you'd eaten something bad or that your bodily humors were out of balance. Medieval medicine was based on this theory that your body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And if they got out of balance, you'd get sick or have bad dreams. So if you were having nightmares, a doctor might recommend bloodletting to rebalance your humors, because nothing helps you sleep better than having a chunk of your blood drained out, right? Let's drift over to the topic of sleep schedules for different groups of people. Monks and nuns probably had the weirdest sleep schedules of anyone because they were required to wake up multiple times during the night for prayer services. This practice was called the night office, or matins, and it happened around 2 or 3 a.m. every single night. So monks would go to bed after evening prayers around 7 or 8 p.m., sleep for a few hours, wake up at 2 a.m. to pray for an hour or two, go back to bed, then wake up again at dawn for more prayers. Their entire lives were structured around prayer, and sleep was just something you fit in between religious obligations. Monks actually perfected the art of sleeping sitting up because they'd often fall asleep during the night prayers, which, fair enough, it's 2 a.m. and you're chanting in Latin, who wouldn't doze off? But falling asleep during prayers was considered sinful, so they'd sit on these special benches with a little ledge that you could sort of lean on but not fully sit on. So if you started to fall asleep, you'd slip off and wake yourself up. It's like a medieval version of those devices that keep truck drivers awake, except instead of preventing highway accidents, it was preventing God from being mad at you for napping during prayers. Peasants and laborers had sleep schedules that were entirely dictated by the sun and the seasons. During summer, when days were long, they'd work from sunrise to sunset and get less sleep. During winter, when it got dark early, they'd sleep more because there was literally nothing else to do. No artificial light meant no evening activity, so you just went to bed. Your entire circadian rhythm was synced with natural daylight, which is actually healthier than how we live now, constantly exposed to artificial light and screens. But medieval peasants weren't exactly living their best lives, so maybe it evens out. Nobility and wealthy merchants had a bit more flexibility, but even they were constrained by the lack of good lighting. You could afford candles, sure, but they were still expensive and not very bright, so most rich people would go to bed relatively early too. They might stay up an hour or two later than peasants, chatting or doing needlework or whatever rich people did for fun, but they weren't pulling all-nighters. Well, unless there was a feast or celebration, in which case all bets were off. Medieval parties could go all night with people eating, drinking, dancing, and probably making decisions they'd regret in the morning. Hangovers haven't changed much over the centuries, apparently.
All right, now that we've covered the basics of how medieval people slept and where they slept, let's talk about the elaborate bedtime rituals they had. Because just getting into bed wasn't a simple process. There was a whole production involved, especially if you were wealthy. And even if you were poor, there were still certain things you were supposed to do before sleep or risk angering God, inviting demons, or just generally having a bad time. For wealthy people, going to bed was basically a ceremony. If you were a noble or royal, you'd have servants helping you undress because your clothes were so complicated that you literally couldn't take them off by yourself. Layers upon layers of fabric, all tied and laced in ways that required another person to undo. Your servants would remove your outer garments, then your middle layers, until you were down to your undergarments or nightshirt. Then they'd help you wash your hands and face, and we're talking just hands and face, not a full bath. That would be crazy. A quick wash with water from a basin, maybe scented with herbs if you were fancy. Then came the hair situation. Women would have their hair brushed and braided by servants, which could take a while if you had long hair. Men might have their hair combed, or they'd just leave it alone if they were feeling lazy. Some men would actually shave their heads partially, or keep their hair very short to avoid lice, which were absolutely everywhere in medieval times. Lice were so common that having them wasn't even considered embarrassing. Everyone just accepted it as a fact of life, like taxes or death. After the physical preparation came the spiritual preparation, which was arguably more important. Everyone, rich or poor, was expected to say prayers before bed. This wasn't optional. You'd kneel by your bed, or wherever you slept if you were too poor for an actual bed, and say your evening prayers. There were specific prayers for bedtime, asking God to protect you through the night and keep demons and evil spirits away. You'd pray for your family, your lord if you were a peasant, the king, and basically anyone in authority over you. Then you'd maybe throw in a prayer for your own soul, because you never knew if you'd wake up in the morning. Death was super random in medieval times, and people were very aware that they could just die at any moment, from disease, violence, or mysterious causes that we now know were probably just infected cuts or food poisoning. Some people would also confess their sins before bed, either to a priest if they had access to one, or just privately to God. The idea was that if you died in your sleep, you wanted your soul to be as clean as possible so you wouldn't go to hell or spend too long in purgatory. Medieval people were genuinely terrified of dying with unconfessed sins. The fear of eternal damnation was very real and very intense, and it shaped pretty much every aspect of their lives, including their bedtime routines. Once the prayers were done, you'd climb into bed, which, if you had a fancy canopy bed, meant opening the heavy curtains, getting in, then closing them behind you. It was like getting into a fabric fort, which honestly sounds kind of cozy. until you remember the bugs and the cold and the smell. You'd arrange your pillows into that propped-up position we talked about, pull your blankets up, and settle in for your first sleep of the night. But wait, we're not done yet, because there were also things you were supposed to avoid before bed. Eating too close to bedtime was considered dangerous. People thought your food wouldn't digest properly if you fell asleep too soon after eating, and it would rot in your stomach and poison you, which, okay, there's actually some truth to that if we're talking about acid reflux, but medieval people thought you'd literally die from it. So you were supposed to finish eating at least an hour or two before bed. Drinking too much liquid before bed was also discouraged, but for practical reasons. Remember, there was no indoor plumbing. If you needed to pee in the middle of the night, you had to either use a chamber pot, which was basically a bucket that you'd keep under your bed or in the corner of the room, or go outside to the latrine, which in winter meant braving the freezing cold just to relieve yourself. So people tried to limit their fluid intake in the evening to avoid the whole midnight bathroom situation. Sex before sleep was a complicated topic. The church had very specific rules about when married couples were allowed to have sex, and there were actually more prohibited days than permitted ones. You couldn't have sex on Sundays, Wednesdays, or Fridays. You couldn't have sex during Lent or Advent or on any feast days. You couldn't have sex if your wife was pregnant, menstruating, or nursing, and you were supposed to avoid sex if you'd be receiving communion the next day. So basically, there were only a handful of days per month when sex was religiously approved. Did people follow these rules? Probably not consistently, but there was definitely guilt associated with it. And some people genuinely tried to adhere to the church's teachings, which meant their sex lives were scheduled according to the liturgical calendar. Romance at its finest. Now let's talk about what people actually did during that midnight waking period, because this is fascinating. Historical records and diaries from the medieval period give us some insight into how people spent those 1 or 2 hours between first and second sleep. Prayer was big, obviously. People would get up and kneel by their bed to say more prayers, or just lie there praying silently. This was considered a particularly holy time when the veil between the earthly and spiritual realms was thin. But it wasn't all religious. This was also prime time for sex, and there are actually medical texts from the period that recommend sex during the watch period specifically. Medieval doctors thought that having sex between sleeps was healthier than doing it right before bed or first thing in the morning. The logic was something about your body being in a more balanced state during the watch period and your humors being properly aligned or whatever, so couples would wake up around midnight, have sex, chat for a bit, then go back to sleep. Which is kind of sweet, actually, like a medieval version of pillow talk. The watch period was also when people would visit neighbors. Yeah, you read that right. People would wake up in the middle of the night, get dressed enough to be decent, and wander over to a neighbor's house for a chat. There are records of people making social calls at 1 a.m., just casually dropping by to see what their neighbors were up to. Everyone was awake during the watch period, so it was socially acceptable. You might share gossip, discuss the day's events, or plan work for the next day. Some people would gather in small groups and tell stories or sing songs. It was basically a midnight social hour, which sounds exhausting, but apparently was just normal.
For people who could read, which wasn't many, but some wealthy folks and clergy, the watch period was prime reading time. You'd light a candle, crack open a book, and read for an hour or so. This was when people would read religious texts, philosophical works, or poetry. There's this prevailing theory among historians that the watch period was actually crucial for intellectual development in medieval Europe because it gave people dedicated quiet time for reading and contemplation. Some scholars argue that we lost something important when we switched to consolidated sleep because we no longer have that built-in reflection period, which is interesting, but also like, I'll keep my 8 hours, thanks. People would also use the watch period for light chores or craft work. Women might do some spinning or sewing by candlelight.
Men might sharpen tools or do minor repairs. Nothing too strenuous. You weren't going to start plowing a field at 1 a.m., but small tasks that didn't require much energy. Some people would prepare things for the next day, like laying out clothes or organizing supplies. It was basically a weird little pocket of productivity in the middle of the night. And then there were the people who just lay there thinking. Medieval people apparently spent the watch period contemplating their lives, their relationships, their place in the universe, all that deep existential stuff. There are letters and diary entries describing the thoughts people had during their nighttime waking hours, and they're surprisingly profound. People would think about their mortality, their faith, their loved ones, their regrets. It was like a built-in therapy session every night, although probably less helpful and more just anxiety-inducing because medieval life was stressful and people had a lot to worry about. Now here's something we haven't talked about yet: snoring. Because people absolutely snored in medieval times, and it was apparently a major source of conflict. Remember, people were sharing beds and rooms with multiple other people, so if you were a snorer, you were ruining everyone else's sleep. There are actual medieval texts complaining about snoring with advice on how to deal with it. Some of the suggested remedies included sleeping on your side instead of your back, avoiding heavy meals before bed, drinking certain herbal teas, or, my personal favorite, tying a ball to your back so you couldn't roll over onto it. That last one actually works, by the way. If you can't sleep on your back, you can't snore as badly. But imagine having a wooden ball strapped to your spine all night. The commitment to letting your bedmate sleep. There were also devices designed to prevent snoring, like special collars that kept your chin up so your airway stayed open. These were basically medieval CPAP machines, except way less effective and way more uncomfortable. Some people would stuff their partner's mouths with cloth to muffle the snoring, which sounds like a suffocation hazard, but apparently was done. Medieval marriages must have been so romantic. Speaking of marital sleeping arrangements, wealthy couples sometimes had separate beds or even separate bedrooms, which was considered a sign of high status. If you could afford separate sleeping spaces, you were doing well financially, but this was also seen as kind of unusual because the expectation was that married couples would share a bed. Sleeping apart could raise questions about the state of your marriage or your ability to fulfill your marital duties. The church was very concerned with making sure married couples were having sex and producing children, so sleeping separately was somewhat suspicious, unless you had a good reason, like illness. Kings and queens often had their own separate bedrooms with their own separate staff, which makes sense given the whole privacy issue. Royal bedrooms were also places where important political business happened. Kings would hold court from their bed sometimes, receiving visitors and making decisions while literally lying down. There was this whole ceremony called the levee, where courtiers would gather to watch the king get out of bed and get dressed in the morning. Seriously. People would show up to watch royalty wake up and put clothes on. It was considered an honor to be invited to the levee. Medieval court life was so weird. The royal bedchamber was also where succession happened in a very literal sense. When a royal baby was born, it was crucial to have witnesses to verify that the baby actually came from the queen's body and wasn't a fake baby smuggled in to secure the succession. So there would be a whole crowd of people in the room during royal births, watching to make sure everything was legitimate. Privacy was not a concept that applied to royalty, especially when it came to producing heirs.
Let's drift over to the topic of children and babies, because their sleep situations were particularly grim. We touched on this briefly, but it deserves its own deep dive because medieval childhood was rough, and sleeping arrangements were just one aspect of that roughness. Babies in medieval times slept in cradles if their families could afford them, or just in bed with their parents if they couldn't. Cradles were usually simple wooden boxes that rocked back and forth, and they'd be placed near the parent's bed or sometimes right in the bed, wedged between the mother and father. The rocking motion was supposed to soothe the baby, and mothers would often tie a string from the cradle to their wrist so they could rock it without fully waking up when the baby cried, which honestly seems like a recipe for disaster, but apparently it worked well enough.
The big problem with bed sharing was the overlaying issue we mentioned earlier. Babies died with horrifying frequency from being accidentally smothered by exhausted parents who rolled over on them in the night. This was such a common problem that the church got involved, declaring that any mother whose baby died from overlaying had committed a sin and needed to do penance. Some regions made it illegal for parents to sleep with infants under a certain age, with actual legal consequences if your baby died that way, which is incredibly cruel when you think about it, because it was almost always an accident and the parent was already devastated by the loss of their child. To prevent overlaying, some families used these devices called arcucci, or go tubes, which were basically wooden frames that you'd place over the baby in the bed. It created a little protective cage, so even if you rolled toward the baby, you'd hit the frame instead of crushing the infant. These contraptions looked deeply uncomfortable and probably weren't that effective, but people tried. Other families would swaddle their babies extremely tightly and place them in a cradle or even hang the cradle from the ceiling beams, which kept the baby safe from being rolled on, but must have been terrifying every time there was a strong wind or someone bumped the cradle. Swaddling in medieval times was intense. Babies were wrapped up like little mummies, with their arms pinned to their sides and their legs bound straight. The idea was that this would help their limbs grow straight and prevent them from becoming deformed. Medieval people genuinely believed that babies' bones were soft like wax and could be molded into the correct shape through tight swaddling. So infants would be bound up for most of the day and night, only being unwrapped for feeding and diaper changes. And yes, they did have a version of diapers, usually just cloth rags that would be washed and reused, which sounds exactly as gross as you'd think it did. The swaddling was so tight that babies couldn't really move at all, which was supposed to keep them calm, but probably just made them miserable. Some babies would be swaddled for months, barely able to move their limbs. Modern doctors would be absolutely horrified by this practice because it restricted circulation and development. But medieval people thought they were helping. The road to hell is paved with good intentions and also with tightly swaddled infants who couldn't scratch their own faces. Babies who cried a lot at night were considered to be possessed, colicky, or afflicted with evil spirits. There were all sorts of folk remedies for crying babies, most of which were either useless or actively harmful. Some mothers would give their babies alcohol, usually ale or watered-down wine, to help them sleep, which technically works because alcohol is a sedative, but it's also, poisoning your infant. Other remedies included giving babies poppy seed tea, which contains opiates. So again, you're basically drugging your baby into unconsciousness, but hey, at least everyone got some sleep, right? Until the baby developed a dependency on opiates or died from an overdose. Medieval parenting was a wild ride. There were also amulets and charms that parents would hang over the cradle to protect the baby from evil spirits and the evil eye. These might include religious symbols, herbs like dill or fennel, or even stranger things like pieces of iron or written prayers sealed in little pouches. Some cultures would put a knife under the baby's cradle to cut any evil influences that tried to approach. Parents were basically throwing everything at the wall to see what would keep their baby alive, because infant mortality was so devastatingly high. Historians estimate that anywhere from 30 to 50% of children died before reaching age 5 in medieval times. That's 1 out of every 2 or 3 children just not making it. The causes were numerous: disease, accidents, malnutrition, exposure to cold, overlaying, and various infections that we can now easily treat with antibiotics. So parents couldn't really get too emotionally attached to infants, which is heartbreaking. There are records of medieval parents giving multiple children the same name because they'd name a baby after a dead sibling, assuming that this one might not survive either. Imagine being the 3rd John in your family because the first 2 Johns died in infancy. The psychological impact of growing up with that knowledge must have been something. Children who survived infancy still had pretty rough sleeping situations. Young children would often sleep together in one bed, piled up for warmth.
In peasant families, all the kids might share one small bed or one area of the floor. In wealthy families, children might have their own rooms but would still often share beds with siblings or nurses. The nurse, basically a live-in nanny, would sleep in the same room as the children she was caring for, sometimes in the same bed to keep an eye on them and make sure they didn't die in the night, because that was a real concern people had. Children were expected to say their prayers before bed, just like adults, and they'd learn these prayers from a very young age. Bedtime prayers for children often included asking God to protect them from monsters, demons, and the devil, which definitely wasn't going to give them nightmares or anything. Medieval children's prayers were basically horror movie scripts. "If I should die before I wake" is a line from a bedtime prayer that's been around for centuries, which is incredibly morbid when you think about it. Like, let's make children contemplate their own death right before they go to sleep. Great idea, medieval parents. Older children, once they reached 7 or 8 years old, were often sent away from home to work or to learn a trade. This was called being placed out or apprenticed, and it was super common across all social classes. Even noble children would be sent to live in other noble households to learn manners and skills. These children would sleep wherever their master or employer put them, which was usually on a pallet on the floor or in a servant's quarters. They'd be separated from their families and sleeping in strange places, surrounded by people they didn't know, starting from a very young age. The emotional toll of this practice must have been significant, but it was just how things were done. Apprentices and young servants had notoriously bad sleeping arrangements. They'd get the worst spots in the house, near the drafty windows, by the doors, in the attics or cellars. They'd have the thinnest blankets and the lumpiest pallets, and they'd be the first ones to get up in the morning to start working, so they were chronically sleep-deprived on top of everything else. Some masters were kind and treated their apprentices well, but others were cruel, and there wasn't much recourse for a child stuck in a bad situation. You couldn't exactly call Child Protective Services in 1350. Teenage children still living at home would have a slightly better sleeping arrangements than younger kids, but not by much. They'd still be sharing beds or rooms, still dealing with the cold and the bugs and all the other unpleasantness of medieval sleeping conditions, but at least by that age they had a better chance of surviving, so that's something. Orphans had it worst of all. Orphanages existed, usually run by the church, but they were overcrowded and underfunded. Orphans would sleep packed together in rows of beds or on the floor, sometimes with barely any blankets or covering. Disease would spread rapidly through these institutions because of the crowded conditions and poor hygiene. Many orphans didn't survive to adulthood, and those who did were often stunted, malnourished, and traumatized. The church preached charity, but the reality of medieval orphanages was pretty bleak. Street children, of which there were many in medieval cities, would sleep wherever they could find shelter. Doorways, under market stalls, in stables with the animals, anywhere that offered some protection from the elements. Winter was especially brutal for homeless children, and many would freeze to death or die from exposure. Cities would find frozen bodies of children in the streets after particularly cold nights, which was just accepted as a tragic but inevitable part of urban life. Nobody was setting up homeless shelters or social services. You either survived or you didn't.
Now, let's talk about the nighttime sounds that medieval people would have heard while trying to sleep, because silence was not a thing. In cities, you'd have the night watchman calling out the hours and yelling "All's well" as they made their rounds. You'd hear dogs barking, cats fighting, rats scurrying around, and various other animals making noise. People would be up during the watch period, so you'd hear neighbors talking, walking around, doing whatever they were doing. Church bells would ring periodically throughout the night to mark the hours for the monks' prayers, so you'd have bells clanging at midnight, 3 a.m., and dawn. In the countryside, you'd have wolves howling, which was genuinely terrifying because wolf attacks on humans did happen, though they were rare. You'd hear owls, which were considered birds of ill omen and associated with death and witchcraft. Hearing an owl at night was supposed to mean someone was about to die, which is a super comforting thought when you're trying to fall asleep. You'd hear the wind, which in a poorly constructed peasant hut meant you'd also feel the wind because medieval buildings were not exactly airtight. Drafts everywhere, all the time. Inside the house, you'd hear the fire crackling if you were lucky enough to still have one burning. You'd hear other people snoring, coughing, moving around, talking in their sleep. You'd hear the sounds of animals if you kept livestock inside, which meant cow and pig sounds at random intervals. You'd hear mice and rats because they were absolutely everywhere, scurrying through the walls and floors. And you'd hear your own stomach growling if you were a peasant who didn't get enough to eat, which was most peasants. For people living in castles or manor houses, you'd hear guards walking the halls because security was a constant concern. You'd hear the wind howling through stone corridors and making weird echoing sounds that probably fed into all those ghost stories about haunted castles. You'd hear other household members moving around, servants doing late-night or early morning chores, and during the winter, you'd hear the creaking and settling of the building as temperatures dropped. The soundscape of medieval nights was much richer than what we experience now in our insulated, temperature-controlled modern homes. And because people believed that nighttime was when supernatural forces were active, every strange sound could be interpreted as something sinister. That thump in the next room? Probably just a servant dropping something. Or maybe it's a demon? Who knows? Better say an extra prayer just in case. Let's drift into the topic of nighttime illnesses and how they affected sleep, because medieval people had a whole host of health problems that would have made sleeping difficult. Chronic pain was super common and basically untreated. If you worked as a laborer, you probably had back pain, joint pain, and muscle aches from years of physical work. There was no Advil, no muscle relaxers, nothing to help you sleep comfortably. You just dealt with it. Some people would use herbal remedies like willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, but it wasn't as concentrated or effective as modern pain medication. Toothaches were another major problem. Dental hygiene was terrible, and tooth decay was rampant. A bad toothache would keep you up all night, and the remedies were either ineffective or terrifying. Some people would try to extract the tooth themselves, or go to a barber surgeon who would yank it out without anesthesia. Others would try remedies like holding a heated stone against the cheek or putting various herbs and poultices on the affected area. None of it worked very well, and people would just suffer through the pain until the tooth either fell out on its own or the infection killed them. Respiratory problems were common because of the poor air quality. If you lived in a city, you were breathing in smoke from thousands of cooking fires and workshops. If you were a peasant, your home was filled with smoke from your own fire because chimneys weren't great and a lot of smoke just stayed in the house. People developed chronic coughs and breathing problems, which would obviously make sleeping difficult. Lying down would make the coughing worse, which is why that propped-up sleeping position was partly practical and not just superstitious. Parasites were a universal problem. Intestinal worms were so common that having them was considered normal. These parasites would cause stomach pain, digestive issues, and general discomfort that would interfere with sleep. And there's nothing quite like feeling a tapeworm moving around in your intestines to keep you awake at night. The treatments for worms were often as bad as the worms themselves. Various purgatives and herbal concoctions that would give you terrible diarrhea in the hopes of expelling the parasites. Fun times. Skin conditions were also super common. Eczema, psoriasis, fungal infections, scabies, and just general irritation from wearing unwashed wool clothing against your skin all day. The itching would be constant and would definitely interfere with sleep. Some people would scratch themselves bloody in their sleep, then wake up with infected wounds. Scabies in particular was a nightmare because it's caused by tiny mites that burrow under your skin, and the itching is most intense at night. So you'd lie there in the dark, itching all over, unable to sleep, slowly going insane from the constant discomfort. Women dealing with menstruation had an especially hard time sleeping. Menstrual cramps were treated with various herbal remedies, some of which probably helped a little, but nothing like modern pain medication. And the menstrual products of the time were basically just rags that you'd tie on and hope they absorbed enough blood that you didn't leak everywhere. Sleeping while menstruating must have been anxious and uncomfortable, worrying about bleeding through your rags onto the bedding, dealing with cramps, and trying to position yourself in a way that didn't make everything worse. Pregnant women had their own set of sleep problems. As pregnancy progressed, finding a comfortable sleeping position would become increasingly difficult, especially with those hard mattresses and that propped-up sleeping angle. Pregnancy heartburn would be exacerbated by lying down, and pregnant women were considered especially vulnerable to evil spirits and the evil eye, so they'd be extra anxious at night, worried about all the things that could go wrong. Given the high rates of maternal mortality, somewhere around 1 to 2% of births ended in the mother's death, that anxiety was completely justified. People suffering from mental illness had terrible sleep as well. Depression, anxiety, and other mental health conditions existed in medieval times, obviously, but they weren't understood or treated properly. Someone suffering from severe depression might lie awake all night, unable to sleep, or might sleep too much as a way of escaping their misery. People with anxiety disorders would be kept awake by their racing thoughts and fears. And anyone showing serious mental illness might be thought to be possessed or cursed, which would just add to their suffering. Old people, well, those lucky enough to reach old age, had all the typical sleep problems that elderly people have today, plus the medieval bonus problems. Aching joints, frequent urination, meaning lots of nighttime trips to the chamber pot, chronic health conditions, and the knowledge that death was probably coming soon. Medieval medicine had basically nothing to offer elderly people. You just deteriorated until you died, and you were expected to accept it gracefully while praying for your soul.
Now let's talk about how seasons affected sleep, because medieval sleeping conditions varied dramatically throughout the year. Summer was actually kind of okay, at least temperature-wise. It was warm, maybe even hot, which meant you didn't need as many blankets and weren't in danger of freezing to death in the night. The downside was that all those bugs we keep mentioning were at their peak activity level. Fleas, bedbugs, lice, mosquitoes, flies, all of them thriving in the warm weather and absolutely feasting on sleeping humans. You'd wake up covered in bites, which would itch like crazy and sometimes get infected. Summer nights were also when disease spread most readily. Plague season was typically summer and early fall when fleas were most active. Dysentery and other digestive diseases were more common in warm weather when food spoiled quickly. So while you weren't freezing, you were at higher risk of catching something that would kill you. Medieval summers were basically a choice between being too hot to sleep comfortably and being eaten alive by insects, or catching the plague. Pick your poison. The long summer days meant people would work longer hours, from dawn to dusk, which could be 15 or 16 hours of daylight. So even though they were going to bed at sunset, that might not be until 9 or 10 p.m., and then they'd be up again at 4 or 5 a.m. Sleep deprivation was a real issue during the summer months, especially for agricultural workers who had to take advantage of the good weather to get all their field work done. Harvest time was particularly brutal, everyone working from dawn to dusk, exhausted, falling into bed, and then having to get up and do it all again the next day. But summer sleeping conditions were paradise compared to winter. Oh boy, winter. Medieval winters were absolutely brutal, and sleeping through them was a survival challenge. First of all, it was cold, like really cold. There's evidence that the medieval period experienced what's called the Little Ice Age, with temperatures significantly lower than they are now. Rivers that haven't frozen in modern times would freeze solid in medieval winters. Snow and ice would last for months. And remember, there was no central heating, no furnaces, no space heaters, no heated blankets. You had a fireplace if you were lucky, and it would provide some heat to the main living area, but bedrooms were not heated separately. The fire would often go out during the night because nobody was staying up to tend it, and by morning, the house would be absolutely frigid. Peasant huts were especially bad because they were poorly insulated, just wattle and daub walls with gaps and cracks everywhere, thatched roofs that leaked, dirt floors that radiated cold. People would pile on every blanket and piece of cloth they owned, wear all their clothes to bed, and still wake up shivering. Frostbite was a real risk especially for extremities. People would lose toes, fingers, noses, and ears to frostbite during particularly harsh winters. Some people would wake up to find that the water in their washing basin had frozen solid overnight, inside the house. That's how cold it was. The bed curtains that wealthy people had weren't just for privacy and demon protection, they were also crucial for warmth.
Those heavy fabric curtains would trap whatever body heat you generated and create a slightly warmer microclimate inside the bed. It was basically a fabric cocoon that might keep you from freezing to death. Poor people who didn't have bed curtains would sometimes hang any available cloth around their sleeping area to try to trap heat. Others would pack straw around the bed for extra insulation. Sharing body heat was essential for survival in winter. This is when bed sharing really made sense from a practical standpoint. A family piled together in one bed would be warmer than individuals sleeping separately. Some people would even bring their animals into bed with them: dogs, cats, sometimes even smaller livestock like chickens or piglets. Yes, medieval peasants sometimes slept with pigs. The pig would provide warmth, and in exchange, the pig also didn't freeze to death. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement, if somewhat unsanitary.
Hot stones or hot water bottles were used by people who could manage it. You'd heat stones by the fire, wrap them in cloth, and tuck them into the bed to provide warmth. This worked for a while, but the stones would cool off after a few hours, and then you'd wake up cold again. Some wealthy people had servants whose job was to warm the bed before the master got in. They'd climb into the bed and lie there until it was body temperature warm, then hop out so the noble could get in. Imagine that being your job, professional bed warmer. Although honestly, in a medieval winter, getting to sleep in the nice warm bed of the manor house, even temporarily, was probably a perk. Winter also meant longer nights, so people were sleeping more simply because there were more hours of darkness. But the flip side was that when you did wake up for the watch period in winter, it was even colder than usual, and getting out of bed at 1 a.m. when it's freezing was a test of willpower. Some people probably just stayed in bed for the watch period, praying or thinking while staying under the covers rather than getting up and moving around. The risk of fire increased in winter because everyone was trying to keep fires burning constantly. Houses would burn down with people inside because the fire got out of control or embers fell on the thatched roof. Some people died of carbon monoxide poisoning from burning fires in poorly ventilated spaces. You'd have to choose between freezing to death or risking fire and smoke inhalation. Medieval winter was just one long series of terrible choices. Food was scarcer in winter too because it was the lean season between the fall harvest and spring planting. People would go to bed hungry, which obviously made sleeping harder. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, so people were more vulnerable to illness during winter. And if you did get sick in winter, you were way more likely to die because your body didn't have the resources to fight off the infection. Winter illnesses like influenza, pneumonia, and bronchitis killed people in droves. Seasonal affective disorder was definitely a thing in medieval times, though they didn't have a name for it. People would become depressed during the long, dark winter months. The combination of less sunlight, cold, hunger, and being cooped up inside made people irritable and despondent. Cabin fever was real. Domestic violence probably increased in winter when families were trapped together in small spaces with no escape. The suicide rate likely went up too, though we don't have great statistics on that. Spring was a time of hope, but also danger. The weather would start warming up, which was great, but then you'd have flooding from melting snow, which could destroy homes and crops. Spring was also when food stores were at their lowest, so people would be starving just as they needed energy for spring planting. There was even a term for this, the starving time, or the hungry gap, the period in late winter and early spring when last year's food was running out and this year's crops weren't ready yet. People would lose weight, become weak, and their sleep would suffer because of hunger and anxiety about whether they'd make it to the next harvest. Fall was generally the best season for sleeping, at least in terms of physical comfort. The weather was mild, the harvest was in, so there was plenty of food, and people could relax a little before winter hit. But there was also the anxiety of preparing for winter, making sure you had enough firewood, enough preserved food, enough warm clothing, and fall was when people would slaughter livestock they couldn't afford to feed through the winter, which meant a lot of butchering and meat preservation work. So even the good season was stressful in its own way. The seasonal variations in sleep patterns also meant that people's circadian rhythms were constantly shifting.
In winter, you might be sleeping 12 or 13 hours a night simply because it was dark that long. In summer, you might only get 6 or 7 hours because the days were so long. Your body never really got to establish a consistent rhythm. Modern sleep scientists would probably be horrified by this constant variation, but medieval people had no choice in the matter. You lived according to the sun and the seasons, period. Religious feast days and festivals disrupted sleep patterns too. During major celebrations, people would stay up late feasting, drinking, and celebrating. The 12 days of Christmas were particularly wild, with constant parties and religious observances. Nobody was getting quality sleep during festival periods. Then you'd have fast days and religious observances that required staying up for special prayers or services. The church calendar dictated a lot of medieval life, including when you could sleep and when you couldn't. Lent was especially rough because you were supposed to be fasting and abstaining from various pleasures, which made people hungry and irritable. Sleep quality probably suffered during Lent because everyone was hangry and spiritually anxious about their sins. But at least Lent was in spring, so the weather was improving. Imagine if Lent had been in winter. People might have actually revolted. Let's move on to something extra cheerful. What happened when people got seriously ill and how that affected their sleep? Because medieval medicine was basically useless for most conditions, being sick often meant a lot of time lying in bed, either recovering or dying, and the treatments themselves often made sleep impossible. If you got sick in medieval times, the first thing that would happen is someone would call for a physician if you were wealthy, or maybe the local wise woman or barber surgeon if you were poor. The physician would examine you, probably by looking at your urine and maybe checking your pulse, and then diagnose you based on the theory of the 4 humors. Your symptoms would be attributed to an imbalance in blood, phlegm, yellow bile, or black bile, and the treatment would be aimed at rebalancing these humors. The most common treatment was bloodletting, which is exactly what it sounds like. They'd cut open a vein or apply leeches to drain out some of your blood because they thought you had too much blood or that the blood was corrupted. This would make you weaker and more anemic, which definitely didn't help you sleep or recover. But medieval doctors were convinced it worked, so they did it constantly. Some patients were bled so aggressively that they died from blood loss rather than their original illness. Other treatments included purging, making you vomit or giving you laxatives to expel the evil humors through your digestive system. You'd be given herbs or compounds that would make you violently ill, and you'd spend hours vomiting or experiencing diarrhea, which is not conducive to restful sleep. The goal was to empty out your body of whatever was making you sick, but mostly it just dehydrated you and made you feel worse. If you had a fever, they might try to sweat it out by piling blankets on you and making you drink hot liquids. Or they might try the opposite approach and apply cold compresses, because medieval medicine was nothing if not contradictory. Either way, you'd be uncomfortable and unable to sleep properly. Fevers themselves caused disturbed sleep with vivid dreams and delirium, and the treatments didn't help at all. Patients with serious illnesses would often be kept in dark, stuffy rooms because fresh air was considered dangerous. Windows would be closed and curtained, fires would be kept burning, and the room would become this hot, airless space where you couldn't breathe properly. The theory was that bad air caused disease, so you wanted to keep the outside air out, but the result was that the sick person was basically suffocating in their own sick room. Some patients probably died from lack of ventilation rather than their actual illness. Pain management was primitive at best. For serious pain, there was opium, which did work but was expensive and not always available. Alcohol was used as an analgesic, so seriously ill people might be given wine or strong ale to dull their pain. This would help you sleep, but it's not exactly quality medical care. Other herbal remedies like valerian or henbane were used as sedatives with varying levels of effectiveness and safety. Henbane, by the way, is toxic in high doses and can cause hallucinations and death, but medieval doctors used it anyway. For surgical procedures, which were rare and incredibly dangerous, there was basically no anesthesia. You might be given alcohol or opium beforehand, but you'd still be conscious or semi-conscious during the surgery.
Barber surgeons would perform amputations, tooth extractions, and other procedures while the patient was awake and screaming. After the surgery, if you survived it, you'd be in horrible pain with no effective pain relief, making sleep nearly impossible. Infection was almost guaranteed because they didn't understand sterilization, so you'd develop a fever and probably die within a few days anyway. Wounded soldiers or people injured in accidents faced similar problems. A serious wound meant intense pain, risk of infection, and treatments that often made things worse. They'd pack wounds with various substances like honey, bread, or herbs, some of which actually helped, like honey, which has antibacterial properties, but others, like bread, were just inviting infection. Wounds would be left open or cauterized with hot irons, which are nightmare fuel. Sleeping with a serious injury was a matter of pure exhaustion, eventually overcoming the pain. Plague victims had an even horrible time. Bubonic plague caused painful, swollen lymph nodes called buboes, along with fever, chills, and eventually organ failure. The buboes were sometimes lanced to drain the pus, which was agonizing. Victims would lie in bed in terrible pain, often delirious from fever, until they either recovered, which was rare, or died within a few days. During plague outbreaks, entire households would be sick at once, all lying there suffering together, and nobody could properly care for anyone else. Sleep was impossible except for brief periods of feverish unconsciousness. Leprosy patients were ostracized and forced to live in leper colonies separate from healthy people. They'd sleep in communal buildings, dealing with the progressive deterioration of their bodies. Leprosy causes nerve damage, so patients would lose sensation in their extremities, which sounds like it might make sleep easier, but the disease also causes terrible disfigurement and social isolation that would cause immense psychological stress. Lepers would ring bells to warn people they were coming, were forbidden from normal social interaction, and were basically treated as walking dead. Their sleep was probably haunted by nightmares of their condition and their separation from loved ones. Mental illness was treated with the same humoral theory as physical illness, which meant bloodletting, purging, and various herbal concoctions. People suffering from what we'd now recognize as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or severe depression were thought to be possessed by demons or punished by God for their sins. Treatment might involve exorcism, prayer, or in extreme cases, restraint or imprisonment. People having psychotic episodes would be tied down or locked up, unable to sleep properly, their condition worsening from the mistreatment. Some would be beaten to drive out the demons, which obviously didn't help their mental state or their ability to sleep. When someone was dying, they'd be surrounded by family and clergy who would pray over them, give them last rites, and help them prepare their soul for death. The dying person would try to stay awake to make their final confession and receive communion one last time, because dying in a state of grace was crucial for getting into heaven. So even in their final hours, people were fighting sleep, trying to stay conscious long enough to complete the religious rituals that would save their soul. Only after the priest had administered the last rites would they allow themselves to slip away. Some dying people would linger for days or weeks, drifting in and out of consciousness. Their families would keep vigil, watching for signs that death was near. There was this belief that the moment of death was when demons would make their final attempt to steal the soul, so having people praying nearby was thought to protect the dying person. The deathbed scene was a major event, with extended family, neighbors, and clergy all gathered around, making it pretty much impossible for the dying person to have any peace or quiet in their final moments. After death, the body would be washed, wrapped in a shroud, and laid out for viewing. People would come to pay their respects, and someone would need to sit with the body overnight to keep watch and pray. This was both a spiritual duty and a practical concern. You wanted to make sure the body didn't get disturbed by animals or that the person was actually just in a coma. Stories of people being buried alive haunted the medieval imagination, and sitting watch over the dead was partly to make sure they were really dead before burial. The sleep of mourners was also disrupted. After a death in the family, people would be expected to pray, fast, and keep vigil. The grief would be intense because death was so common, but still personally devastating each time. People would have nightmares about their dead loved ones, dream that they were being visited by the deceased person's ghost, and generally have disturbed sleep for weeks after a death. And since death was so common, especially of children, people were probably in a constant state of grief and disrupted sleep throughout their lives.
All right, let's get into the really weird stuff. All the supernatural beliefs about sleep, dreams, and nighttime. Medieval people had an incredibly rich and terrifying mythology about what happened while you slept, and it affected everything about how they approached bedtime. We already mentioned the nightmare, the demon that would sit on your chest and suffocate you, but there were so many other nocturnal entities that people believed in. Incubi and succubi were demons that would visit you at night and have sex with you while you slept. An incubus would visit women, a succubus would visit men, and these encounters were thought to be real physical events, not just dreams. If you woke up feeling aroused or had sexual dreams, that was evidence that a demon had visited you. The scary part is that women who claimed to have been visited by incubi were sometimes accused of having consensual sex with demons, which was considered a form of witchcraft. There were actual trials where women were convicted of having sex with demons and punished for it. Meanwhile, monks and priests who had nocturnal emissions would blame succubi rather than admit they'd had sexual thoughts, because acknowledging sexual desire was sinful. So demons were a convenient scapegoat for natural bodily functions that the church had labeled as shameful. Witches were believed to fly out at night to attend Sabbaths where they'd worship the devil and perform evil magic. During the medieval witch craze, which really ramped up in the late medieval period and into the early modern era, people were genuinely terrified that witches were sneaking around at night causing harm. If your child died suddenly, if your cow stopped giving milk, if your crops failed, these things might be blamed on witches who'd cursed you in the night. The belief in witchcraft created an atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion that must have made sleeping very anxiety-inducing. There were also revenants, corpses that rose from their graves to torment the living. These weren't quite the zombies of modern horror, but more like animated dead bodies that would walk around at night causing trouble. If someone had died and not received proper burial rites, or if they'd been particularly wicked in life, their body might refuse to stay in the grave. There are actual medieval accounts of people claiming to have been attacked by revenants, and communities would sometimes exhume suspected revenants and destroy the body by beheading it, driving a stake through it, or burning it. Ghosts were everywhere in the medieval mind. The souls of the dead might return to visit the living, either to deliver messages, ask for prayers, or because they were stuck in purgatory and needed help. Seeing a ghost was considered a serious matter. You'd tell a priest who would try to figure out what the ghost wanted. Sometimes ghosts would appear in dreams, which was thought to be a form of divine communication. Other times they'd appear as visible apparitions that you'd see while awake, which was way more terrifying. Vampires existed in medieval folklore, though they were different from the modern concept. Medieval vampires were more like revenants who drank blood or fed on the life force of the living. They were associated with plague and disease. If an epidemic hit a village, people might dig up recent burials looking for vampires that were causing the deaths. They'd look for signs that the corpse was still alive, like blood in the mouth, lack of decomposition, or the body being in a different position than when it was buried. If they found these signs, they'd destroy the corpse to stop the vampire. The belief in the evil eye was also strong. People thought that certain individuals had the power to curse you just by looking at you, especially while you slept and were vulnerable. This is why protective amulets and symbols were so important. They were supposed to deflect the evil eye and keep you safe from being cursed. Babies were especially susceptible to the evil eye, which is one reason they were so heavily protected with charms and prayers. Fairy folk, or the Fae, were another nighttime concern. Fairies were not the cute, friendly creatures of Disney movies. Medieval fairies were dangerous, unpredictable beings who might steal human children and replace them with changelings, or lure adults into their realm where time moved differently, and you'd return after what felt like one night to find that decades had passed. People would leave offerings for fairies, like milk or bread, to appease them and avoid being targeted. And you definitely didn't want to accidentally wander into a fairy circle at night because bad things would happen. Dreams themselves were thought to be messages or prophecies. A vivid dream might be a warning from God, a temptation from the devil, or a visit from a deceased relative. People took dream interpretation very seriously and would consult dream books or wise people to understand what their dreams meant. Recurring dreams were especially significant. They were thought to be important messages that you needed to pay attention to. There was also this concept called walking in your sleep with the dead, which was basically the medieval version of near-death experiences. If you were seriously ill and had a vivid dream of traveling to the afterlife or seeing heaven and hell, this was considered evidence of divine revelation. Some people claimed to have visited purgatory or hell in their dreams and seen the suffering of souls there, which would be shared as cautionary tales to encourage people to live virtuously. Sleep paralysis, as we mentioned earlier, was terrifying because people thought it was a demon attack. You'd wake up unable to move, maybe see shadowy figures or feel pressure on your chest, and be convinced that something evil was trying to kill you or possess you. The experience was so common and so similar across different people that it reinforced the belief in night demons. Because how else would you explain multiple people having the exact same terrifying experience? Nightmares were believed to be sent by the devil to tempt you to sin or to punish you for sins you'd already committed. If you had a nightmare, you might tell a priest about it during confession, and they'd give you penance and prayers to say to protect yourself from further demonic attacks. Really vivid nightmares might be seen as evidence that you were being targeted by evil forces, which would make you even more anxious and more likely to have disturbed sleep. There were rituals and prayers specifically designed to protect you from nighttime spiritual dangers. People would say the Compline prayer before bed, which was part of the daily prayer cycle and specifically asked for protection through the night. They'd make the sign of cross over themselves and their bed. Some people would sprinkle holy water around the room. Wealthier people might have relics of saints in their bedrooms for protection. Having a medal or image of these saints in your bedroom was thought to keep you safe. The bedtime ritual of prayer wasn't just about being devout. It was genuine spiritual self-defense. Medieval people believed they were in real danger every night from supernatural forces, and prayer was the main weapon they had. The anxiety this must have caused is hard to imagine. Every night, you'd go to bed knowing that demons, witches, evil spirits, and who knows what else might try to attack you while you were defenseless in sleep. This also explains why people were so careful about their spiritual state before bed. If you went to sleep with unconfessed sins, you were more vulnerable to demonic attack. If you were in the state of grace, having recently confessed and taken communion, you were better protected. So the moral pressure to stay right with God wasn't just about the afterlife, it was about surviving the night. Some regions had specific local monsters or entities that people feared. In England, there was the Black Shuck, a ghostly black dog with glowing eyes that was an omen of death. In German regions, there was the Alp, a creature that would cause nightmares and breathe on sleepers, causing them to have bad dreams. Every culture had its own nighttime horrors that kept people awake with anxiety. Weather omens and signs seen at night were also taken seriously. If you saw strange lights in the sky, heard unusual sounds, or noticed animals behaving strangely at night, these were potential warnings of danger, plague, or death. People were hyper-aware of anything unusual because it might be a sign from God or a warning of impending disaster.
This constant vigilance can't have been good for sleep quality.
Let's talk about how social class affected every aspect of sleep in medieval times, because the gap between how a king slept and how a peasant slept was absolutely massive. We've touched on this throughout, but it deserves a deeper look because the inequalities are kind of staggering. Starting at the very top, kings and queens had the most elaborate sleeping arrangements imaginable. Royal beds were massive pieces of furniture, often custom-built with carved wooden frames, expensive fabric canopies, and mattresses stuffed with the finest down feathers. The sheets would be linen, or even silk, changed regularly by servants. The blankets would be wool or fur, soft and warm. The whole setup would cost more than a peasant would earn in their entire lifetime. But even with all that luxury, royal sleep was complicated by politics and security. Kings were constantly worried about assassination, so they'd have guards posted outside and sometimes inside their bedchambers. Some kings would sleep with a weapon nearby just in case. The paranoia was justified. Plenty of medieval rulers were murdered in their sleep or in their bedrooms. So, even in a luxurious bed, you might be lying there wondering if tonight was the night someone tried to stab you. Royal bedrooms were also semi-public spaces where important business happened. Kings would receive advisors and make decisions while literally in bed, which is a power move, but also means you never really got private time to just sleep. The morning levee ceremony we mentioned earlier was a whole production where courtiers would come watch the king wake up, get out of bed, and get dressed. Every aspect of royal life was performed for an audience, including sleep. Queens had their own issues. They were expected to produce heirs, which meant constant pressure around pregnancy and childbirth. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and maternal mortality were common even among the wealthy, and queens who failed to produce male heirs could be divorced, exiled, or worse. The anxiety around this must have severely impacted sleep. Plus, royal births were public events, with witnesses, so even giving birth wasn't private. Noble families just below royalty had similar sleeping arrangements, though scaled down a bit. They'd have large, comfortable beds, private bedrooms, and servants to attend to them. But they'd also have to deal with the political complexities of medieval court life, managing alliances, worrying about their standing with the king, dealing with rival noble families. Nobles who fell out of favor could lose everything, including their comfortable beds, and end up imprisoned or executed. So even with physical comfort, the psychological stress was intense. Knights and minor nobility had decent sleeping arrangements by medieval standards, but nothing extravagant. A knight might have a proper bed with a feather mattress, but it wouldn't be huge or elaborately decorated. When traveling or on military campaigns, knights would sleep in tents, or sometimes just on the ground wrapped in their cloaks. Crusaders spent years sleeping rough, dealing with unfamiliar climates, foreign diseases, and constant danger. The romantic image of knights doesn't include the reality of sleeping in armor during a siege, or trying to rest while worrying about enemy attacks. Merchants and successful craftsmen, the medieval middle class, had reasonably comfortable sleeping situations. They'd have actual beds with decent mattresses, their own bedrooms separate from their workshops or shops, and enough blankets to stay warm. They could afford candles to extend their evening hours a bit, but they'd still be dealing with city noise, the stress of business concerns, worries about thieves or competitors, and all the usual medieval hazards. A merchant's wealth could evaporate quickly through bad luck or economic changes, so there was always anxiety underlying everything. Apprentices and journeyman craftsmen, as we mentioned, had it rougher. They'd sleep in their master's household, usually in the workshop or in servants' quarters, on simple pallets or sometimes just on the floor. Their sleep schedules were dictated by their work. They'd go to bed when the master said and wake up when work started, which was early. The lucky ones had masters who treated them well, but plenty of apprentices were essentially indentured servants who were worked hard and given minimal comfort. Parish priests and local clergy had modest but generally adequate sleeping arrangements. A priest might have a small house next to the church with a simple bed, enough to keep him comfortable.
His needs were supposed to be modest anyway. The church emphasized humility and rejection of worldly comforts. So, some priests lived up to this ideal. Others, not so much. Corrupt priests might live quite comfortably while neglecting their parishes, but that's a whole other topic. Monks and nuns in monasteries had regimented sleeping schedules, as we discussed. The sleeping quarters, called dormitories, were usually large rooms with rows of simple beds or sleeping pallets. Privacy was minimal. Some orders required monks to sleep on straw mattresses as part of their vow of poverty. The Cistercians and other strict orders had particularly harsh sleeping conditions: cold stone buildings, thin blankets, hard surfaces, all designed to mortify the flesh and keep you focused on spiritual rather than physical comfort. The night office prayers meant monks were chronically sleep-deprived, which was actually part of the point. Exhaustion was supposed to make you more spiritually receptive and less likely to be tempted by sinful thoughts. Medieval monasticism had a complicated relationship with the body. Physical suffering was seen as bringing you closer to God. So monks would deliberately make themselves uncomfortable, including during sleep, as a form of penance and devotion.
Nuns had similar conditions, with the added issue that convents were often underfunded compared to male monasteries. Nuns might have even worse sleeping conditions: colder buildings, thinner blankets, less food. Some women entered convents voluntarily out of religious devotion, but others were basically dumped there by families who couldn't afford marriage dowries or didn't know what else to do with them. Being a nun when you didn't really want to be one, sleeping in cold, uncomfortable conditions while following a harsh schedule, must have been miserable. University students, and yes, medieval universities existed, had sleeping arrangements that sound familiar to any modern college student. They'd cram into shared rooms, sleep on cheap straw mattresses, and stay up late studying or drinking. University towns were rowdy places, with students causing trouble, fighting with locals, and generally being young and stupid. The sleeping conditions weren't great, but students were young and could handle it better than older folks. Soldiers and men-at-arms had probably the worst sleeping conditions of anyone who wasn't literally homeless. Military camps were chaotic, uncomfortable, and dangerous. You'd sleep on the ground, maybe with a tent if you were lucky, surrounded by thousands of other men who smelled terrible. Latrines were inadequate, so the whole camp would reek. Disease spread rapidly in military camps. Dysentery, typhus, and other illnesses killed more soldiers than combat did. During sieges, conditions were even worse. If you were inside a besieged castle or town, you'd be dealing with overcrowding, dwindling food supplies, and constant stress from bombardment and attacks. If you were outside besieging the place, you'd be living in a camp for weeks or months, bored and uncomfortable, sleeping in shifts to maintain watch. Either way, it was miserable. Sailors on medieval ships had terrible sleeping conditions. Ships were cramped, wet, and constantly moving. Sailors would sleep on deck or in the hold, often just lying down wherever there was space. The smell of unwashed bodies, bilge water, and rotting provisions was overwhelming. Seasickness was common, and there was always the danger of storms, pirates, or just getting lost at sea. Some sailors would rig hammocks, which actually helped with the rocking of the ship, but most just slept on hard wooden surfaces. Peasant farmers, who made up the vast majority of the population, had the sleeping conditions we've described throughout this script: straw beds, shared spaces, minimal privacy, extreme temperature variations, bugs everywhere. But at least they had some stability. They'd sleep in the same place every night, in homes they'd lived in for years, surrounded by family. It wasn't comfortable, but it was familiar. Landless laborers and migrant workers had it worse than settled peasants. They'd move around looking for work, sleeping wherever they could find shelter. Sometimes they'd sleep in barns, sometimes outdoors, sometimes in cheap lodgings. The instability and insecurity must have made sleep difficult even when they had a place to lie down. Not knowing where you'd sleep the next night or whether you'd find work to earn enough to eat creates chronic stress that ruins sleep quality. Serfs, who were bound to the land and couldn't leave without their lord's permission, had a different kind of stress. They weren't technically slaves, but they weren't free either. They owed labor and produce to their lord, and their entire lives were controlled by someone else. The psychological weight of that lack of freedom must have been crushing. You'd go to sleep knowing you'd wake up and do the same hard labor tomorrow and the next day and every day until you died, with no hope of change. Slaves, yes, slavery existed in some parts of medieval Europe, especially in the early medieval period, had the absolute worst conditions. They'd sleep wherever their master designated, usually the worst spot available, with minimal bedding. They could be woken up at any time to work, bought and sold, separated from families. The trauma of enslavement would make any kind of restful sleep nearly impossible. Beggars and the homeless were at the very bottom, sleeping on streets, in doorways, under bridges, anywhere they could find shelter. Cities would sometimes have charitable institutions that provided basic shelter for the poor, but there were never enough beds for everyone who needed them. In winter, homeless people would literally freeze to death on the streets. In summer, they'd deal with heat, insects, and being constantly moved along by authorities who didn't want them visible. Lepers and other outcasts had their own separate communities where sleeping conditions varied. Some leper colonies were relatively well organized with basic housing. Others were just collections of desperate people living in shacks on the outskirts of towns. The social isolation combined with physical suffering made their lives especially bleak. The gap between rich and poor in terms of sleep quality was enormous, but here's the thing. Even the richest people couldn't escape many of the fundamental problems of medieval sleep. They might have softer beds, but they still dealt with bugs, cold, disease, and the psychological stresses of medieval life. They still had to sleep in 2 shifts. They still believed in demons and witches. They still worried about dying in their sleep. Money could buy you comfort, but it couldn't buy you safety from plague, or prevent your children from dying, or guarantee you'd wake up in the morning. Every social class lived with the fundamental uncertainty and danger of medieval existence, and that affected everyone's sleep. The peasant and the king both lay awake at night worrying about death, just with different quality mattresses under them.
Now let's talk about what happened when people didn't get enough sleep. Because sleep deprivation was incredibly common in medieval times for all the reasons we've been discussing. And while medieval people didn't have modern sleep science to understand what was happening, they definitely experienced the consequences. First, the obvious physical effects. Chronic sleep deprivation weakens your immune system, which in a time before antibiotics or vaccines meant you were way more susceptible to the diseases that were constantly circulating. Someone who wasn't sleeping well would be the first person in their household to catch whatever illness was going around, and they'd be more likely to die from it. In a world where even minor infections could kill you, being immunocompromised from lack of sleep was genuinely life-threatening. Sleep deprivation also slows wound healing, which was a big deal in medieval times. If you got injured, which was common given how dangerous daily life was, and you weren't sleeping well, that wound would take longer to heal and be more likely to get infected. A simple cut that would heal fine in a well-rested person could turn into a deadly infection in someone who was exhausted. Cognitive effects were probably even more impactful. Sleep-deprived people have trouble concentrating, make poor decisions, have slower reaction times, and are more irritable. In medieval times, this could get you killed. If you were a soldier who hadn't slept properly and your reactions were slow, you'd die in combat. If you were a craftsman who made a mistake because you were exhausted, you might lose a finger to your tools or create faulty products that ruined your reputation. If you were a peasant farmer who wasn't fully alert while working with large animals or sharp implements, accidents happened. The irritability and mood changes from sleep deprivation probably contributed to a lot of interpersonal conflict. Medieval people were already dealing with extreme stress, and adding chronic exhaustion on top of that would make everyone short-tempered and prone to arguments. Domestic violence, bar fights, feuds between neighbors. Some of this was probably exacerbated by everyone being tired and cranky all the time. Judgment and decision-making suffer when you're sleep-deprived, which had serious consequences for leaders.
Kings and nobles who weren't sleeping well would make bad military or political decisions that could cost lives or lose territories. Merchants might make poor business choices. Judges might hand down unjust verdicts. The lack of sleep affected everyone's ability to function, but when the sleep-deprived person had power over others, the consequences spread. Hallucinations can occur with severe sleep deprivation, and in medieval times, these would absolutely be interpreted as supernatural experiences. If someone who hadn't slept in days started seeing things, they'd think they were seeing demons, angels, or ghosts. This would reinforce supernatural beliefs and possibly lead to accusations of witchcraft or possession. Some of the visionary religious experiences reported by medieval mystics might have actually been sleep deprivation-induced hallucinations. Microsleeps, those brief moments where your brain essentially forces you to sleep for a few seconds even though you're trying to stay awake, were dangerous in medieval times. If you had a microsleep while doing something dangerous like climbing a ladder, working with fire, or riding a horse, you could die. Guards who were supposed to be keeping watch might have microsleeps and miss important threats. The castle gets attacked because the guard dozed off for 30 seconds. That kind of thing actually happened. Sleep deprivation also affects pain perception, making you more sensitive to pain. So all those chronic aches and pains that medieval people dealt with would feel even worse if they weren't sleeping properly. This would create a vicious cycle. Pain keeps you from sleeping, then lack of sleep makes the pain worse, which keeps you from sleeping, and so on. For women, sleep deprivation could affect menstrual cycles and fertility. In a time when producing children was considered a woman's primary purpose, any fertility issues were a huge deal. Some women might have struggled to conceive partly because they were so chronically exhausted. Of course, medieval medicine wouldn't have made this connection. They'd blame it on humoral imbalances or divine punishment instead. Pregnant women who weren't sleeping well were at higher risk for all sorts of complications. Modern research shows that sleep deprivation during pregnancy increases risks of preterm birth, low birth weight, and various other problems. Medieval women were already dealing with high maternal and infant mortality rates, and inadequate sleep made everything worse. For children, chronic sleep deprivation affects growth and development. Medieval children who weren't sleeping enough would be shorter, weaker, and more sickly than children who got adequate rest. Given that many children were already malnourished, adding sleep deprivation on top of that created stunted adults. Some of the height differences between social classes might have been partly due to better sleep among the wealthy, not just better nutrition. Mental health was obviously affected. Depression and anxiety are both caused and worsened by lack of sleep. Medieval people were already dealing with incredibly stressful lives, and chronic exhaustion would push many people over the edge into serious mental health crises. The number of people suffering from what we'd now recognize as clinical depression must have been enormous, and sleep deprivation was making it worse. Work performance suffered across the board. A sleep-deprived craftsman would do worse work. A sleep-deprived farmer would be less productive. Accidents increased. Quality decreased. In an economy where most people were living on the edge of subsistence, any decrease in productivity could mean the difference between eating and starving. For people in positions requiring quick thinking, merchants negotiating deals, lawyers arguing cases, physicians treating patients, sleep deprivation meant they did their jobs worse. Some people probably died because their doctor was too exhausted to think clearly and prescribed the wrong treatment. Trials might have ended unjustly because the judge or lawyers hadn't slept properly. Business deals might have been disasters because someone's judgment was impaired by exhaustion. The cumulative effect of multiple generations of sleep-deprived people is hard to calculate, but it couldn't have been good. Entire populations were operating below their potential because nobody was getting adequate rest. Innovation, creativity, and problem-solving all suffer when people are tired. How much medieval progress was slowed down because everyone was exhausted all the time? Now, medieval people did understand on some level that sleep was important. They didn't have the scientific framework we have now, but they knew that people who didn't sleep became sick and died. They had folk wisdom about the importance of rest, even if they didn't understand the mechanisms. Sayings like early to bed, early to rise date back centuries because people recognized patterns even if they didn't know why.
But understanding that sleep is important doesn't help much when your material conditions make adequate sleep impossible. A peasant couldn't just decide to sleep more when they were freezing, hungry, covered in bug bites, and had to wake up at dawn to work in the fields. A mother couldn't sleep when her baby was crying and needed feeding. A night watchman couldn't sleep during his shift even if he was exhausted. People did the best they could with what they had. Some people probably managed better than others. Individual differences in sleep needs exist. Some people can function on less sleep than others. In medieval times, the people who naturally needed less sleep would have had an advantage. They'd be more productive, healthier, and more successful. Meanwhile, people who needed more sleep but couldn't get it would struggle more. There were probably also cultural differences in how different regions or groups handled sleep. Some communities might have had practices that promoted better sleep, while others had practices that made it worse. Unfortunately, we don't have detailed records about daily life practices for most medieval people, so it's hard to know for sure. What we do know is that the combined effects of chronic sleep deprivation on an entire population would have been catastrophic. Higher disease rates, more accidents, worse decision-making, increased violence, impaired development, all of this contributed to making medieval life even harder and more dangerous than it already was. Sleep deprivation was one more factor, along with poor nutrition, inadequate medicine, and social inequality that kept most medieval people from reaching their full potential.
Let's float over to the fascinating topic of how dreams and visions were interpreted in medieval culture, because this was a huge deal that affected religion, politics, and daily life. Dreams weren't just random brain activity. They were considered messages that needed to be decoded and taken seriously. The Bible is full of significant dreams. Jacob's ladder, Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, the dreams that warned Joseph, Jesus' stepfather, to flee to Egypt. These stories made it clear that God communicated through dreams, so medieval Christians believed that their own dreams might contain divine messages. If you had a particularly vivid dream, you'd think about it carefully, maybe tell others about it, possibly consult with a priest about its meaning. But dreams could also come from the devil, which made interpretation tricky. A dream that seemed to be telling you to do something might be divine guidance or demonic temptation. How could you tell the difference? Generally, dreams that aligned with Christian teaching and encouraged virtue were considered to be from God, while dreams that tempted you to sin were obviously from the devil, but the line wasn't always clear. There were also dreams that were just dreams. Medieval scholars recognized that some dreams were just your mind processing daily events and didn't have any deeper meaning. Eating too much before bed could give you weird dreams that didn't mean anything. But people erred on the side of caution. Better to take a meaningless dream seriously than to ignore a divine message. Dream interpretation guides existed throughout the medieval period, often based on ancient texts. These guides would list common dream symbols and their meanings. Dreaming of water might mean change or purification. Dreaming of flying might mean spiritual elevation or dangerous pride. Dreaming of teeth falling out was usually bad news, possibly indicating death. These interpretation guides were taken seriously, and people would consult them like we might check WebMD today, except with more prophetic anxiety. Religious visions were a special category of dream experience that carried enormous weight. Saints and mystics would report having visions of Jesus, Mary, angels, or scenes from heaven and hell. These visions might come during sleep or in trance-like states while awake. The church had an official process for evaluating whether visions were genuine divine experiences or hallucinations, delusions, or demonic deception. Women mystics, in particular, reported elaborate visions. Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, Catherine of Siena, and many others had vivid visionary experiences that they recorded in writings. Some of these women became influential religious figures based on their visions. But they also faced skepticism and accusations. Was this really God speaking through them? Or were they crazy? Or were they being manipulated by demons? The visions often came during periods of extreme asceticism, when the mystic was fasting, sleep-deprived, and physically weakening themselves through various forms of self-denial. From a modern perspective, we can recognize that starvation and exhaustion cause altered mental states, including hallucinations. But medieval people saw the physical suffering as a prerequisite for spiritual visions. You had to mortify the flesh to free the spirit. Men had religious visions too, of course. Monks who followed harsh ascetic practices would sometimes report visionary experiences. These visions would be scrutinized by their superiors to determine authenticity. If accepted as genuine, they'd be written down and circulated, becoming part of religious literature. If rejected, the monk might be disciplined for either lying or being deceived by demons. Prophetic dreams were particularly important. If someone dreamed about the future and the dream came true, this was evidence that God had given them a vision. Prophets might warn of impending disasters, wars, or divine judgment. Political figures paid attention to prophetic dreams, sometimes changing their plans based on someone's vision. Of course, this created opportunities for manipulation. Someone could claim to have had a prophetic dream that conveniently supported their political agenda. Kings might claim divine guidance through dreams to justify their actions. It was hard to prove or disprove someone's dream, so there was a lot of room for dishonesty or self-deception. Deathbed visions were another significant category. People who were dying sometimes reported seeing angels, deceased relatives, or glimpses of the afterlife. These visions were taken as evidence of what awaited after death and were shared as teaching stories. A dying person who saw heaven would describe beautiful visions of light and joy. Someone who saw hell would describe terrifying scenes of torment. These accounts reinforced Christian teachings about salvation and damnation. Some deathbed visions were probably genuine altered states caused by the dying process. Brain hypoxia, fever, medications, or just the stress of dying can cause vivid experiences. But medieval people interpreted them as actual glimpses of the spiritual realm. Families would gather around dying relatives, partly to hear what they saw, and these accounts would be remembered and repeated. Shared dreams, or collective visions, sometimes occurred where multiple people claimed to have the same dream or vision. These were considered especially significant because they couldn't be dismissed as individual delusion. If an entire monastery saw the same vision, or if several people in a village had the same prophetic dream, this was treated as a major supernatural event requiring interpretation. Dreams about saints were common and important. If you dreamed that a saint appeared to you, this might mean the saint was interceding for you or had a message for you. People would pray to specific saints for help with specific problems, and then hope to receive a response through dreams. A sick person might pray to Saint Sebastian and then dream of him, interpreting this as a sign that they'd recover. Relics of saints were sometimes brought to sick people's bedsides in hopes that the saint's power would bring healing dreams. Sleeping in a church near a saint's relics was thought to be especially likely to produce significant dreams. Some people would deliberately sleep in sacred spaces, hoping for visionary experiences. Nightmares, as we've discussed, were usually interpreted as demonic attacks, but they might also be warnings or punishments from God. If you had a nightmare after committing a sin, this might be God's way of making you feel guilty and encouraging you to repent. The content of nightmares would be analyzed for meaning just like any other dream. Sleep paralysis, which we mentioned earlier, produced experiences that fit perfectly with medieval supernatural beliefs. The feeling of a presence in the room, the inability to move, the sense of pressure or suffocation, all of this matched the expected symptoms of demonic attack. People experiencing sleep paralysis would be absolutely convinced they were being assaulted by evil spirits because what other explanation made sense? Modern sleep science knows that sleep paralysis happens when you wake up before the brain has turned off the paralysis it induces during REM sleep. It's a glitch, basically. But medieval people didn't know about REM sleep or brain chemistry. They only knew that something was holding them down and they couldn't move or scream, which is legitimately terrifying. Sleepwalking was viewed with suspicion and fear. A person who walked in their sleep might be thought to be possessed, or their soul might have left their body temporarily, leaving them vulnerable. Sleepwalkers might injure themselves or others while not fully conscious, which added to the fear. There are medieval accounts of sleepwalkers doing bizarre things, walking on rooftops, leaving the house and wandering far away, even committing violence, all while asleep. Some people claim to have prophetic or healing powers that came through dreams. A folk healer might say that a cure was revealed to them in a dream. A person might claim that God showed them where to find something lost, or who committed a crime, or what the weather would be. These claims might be believed or dismissed depending on the person's reputation and whether their predictions came true. The boundary between waking and sleeping states was understood differently in medieval times. Trance states, meditation, ecstatic experiences, all of these were related to sleep and dreams in the medieval mind. Someone in a trance might be experiencing something similar to dreaming while awake. The lack of clear understanding about consciousness and brain states meant everything got lumped together as variations of spiritual experience. Incubation practices, deliberately sleeping in sacred spaces to receive dreams, were common. Someone with a serious problem might spend the night in a church or at a saint's shrine hoping to receive guidance through dreams. This practice had ancient pagan roots, but was Christianized in the medieval period. The logic was that sleeping in a holy place made you more receptive to divine communication. Dream journals or records were kept by some educated people, especially clergy. They'd write down their significant dreams and reflect on their meanings. These records provide historians with fascinating insights into medieval psychology and belief systems. Reading someone's dream journal from 600 years ago, you see the same anxieties, fears, and desires that people have today, just filtered through a completely different cultural framework. The interpretation of dreams was part art, part science, and part theology in medieval thought. It required knowledge of scripture, understanding of symbolism, and discernment of spirits. Not just anyone could interpret dreams authoritatively. It was a skill that required learning and, ideally, spiritual gifts. But everyone had opinions about what their dreams meant, just like today.
Now let's talk about how sleep patterns slowly changed as the medieval period progressed into the early modern era, because the weird two-sleep pattern didn't last forever. The changes were gradual and tied to broader social and economic transformations that were reshaping European society. The rise of cities was a big factor. As more people moved to urban areas for trade and manufacturing, the rhythm of life started to shift away from the purely agricultural cycle that had dominated medieval sleeping patterns. Cities didn't completely shut down at sunset the way rural villages did. There was more activity after dark. Taverns stayed open, workshops might continue working by candlelight, and there was simply more to do. Street lighting started appearing in some cities in the late medieval period, initially just torches or lanterns at major intersections, but eventually more widespread. This didn't turn night into day by any means. The lighting was dim and patchy, but it made nighttime urban navigation safer and extended the hours when people could be active outside their homes. More nighttime activity meant sleep schedules started to shift. The invention of the mechanical clock in the 13th century was hugely significant, though it took a long time for clocks to become widespread. Before clocks, time was measured by the sun, church bells, and rough estimates. With clocks, time became more precisely measured and standardized. This eventually led to more rigid work schedules in the expectation that people would show up at specific times, which conflicted with the flexible two-sleep pattern. Guilds and workshops in cities started operating on stricter schedules as commerce became more complex. Apprentices and workers were expected to start at certain times and work for certain numbers of hours. This made the variable, season-dependent sleep schedule less practical. People started sleeping in one continuous block more consistently because it fit better with the emerging industrial time discipline. The invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century made books more available, which meant more people could read, which meant more people wanted artificial light for evening reading. The demand for better lighting increased, and improvements in candle making and eventually oil lamps made evening illumination more accessible to more people. This extended waking hours further into the night. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century brought changes in religious practices that affected sleep.
Protestant theology generally de-emphasized the elaborate nighttime prayer rituals that Catholic monasticism had maintained. While Protestants still prayed before bed, they didn't have the same tradition of waking for midnight prayers. This may have made consolidated sleep more acceptable in Protestant regions. Colonial expansion and global trade created new pressures on sleep patterns. Merchants and sailors involved in long-distance trade had to adapt to different schedules and rhythms. Ships operated around the clock with watches, dividing the crew into shifts. This watch system was different from the traditional two-sleep pattern and represented a move toward the continuous waking-sleeping division we know today. The Little Ice Age, which lasted roughly from the 14th to 19th centuries, made winters even more brutal than usual. This may have actually reinforced sleeping patterns in some ways. When it's brutally cold and dark for most of the day, sleeping more makes sense. But it also created pressures to develop better heating and lighting technologies, which eventually enabled people to stay up later despite the cold and dark. Coffee and tea started being imported to Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, though they didn't become widely available until later. The introduction of caffeinated beverages allowed people to stay awake longer and changed sleep patterns dramatically. Someone who drinks coffee in the evening can stay up later and sleep less, which wouldn't have been possible before stimulants became available. The scientific revolution and enlightenment brought new attitudes toward time, productivity, and sleep. Thinkers began emphasizing rationality, efficiency, and the value of waking productivity over sleeping hours. Sleep started to be seen as wasted time rather than a natural, necessary process with its own rhythms. The idea that you should minimize sleep to maximize productive waking hours gained traction. The Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries finally killed off the two-sleep pattern for most people. Factory work required showing up at specific times and working long, continuous shifts. There was no room for waking in the middle of the night to pray or chat with neighbors. You had to sleep when you could to be ready for the next shift. Artificial lighting in factories enabled round-the-clock production, creating shift work that completely disconnected sleep from natural daylight cycles. By the 19th century, the two-sleep pattern had been almost entirely forgotten in industrialized societies. People slept in one continuous block, or tried to, and the idea of waking for an hour or two in the middle of the night seemed strange. It wasn't until modern historians started researching medieval sleep patterns that we rediscovered this practice had ever existed. The change from two sleeps to one consolidated sleep period wasn't necessarily progress or improvement, it was adaptation to new economic and social structures. Some researchers argue that we lost something valuable when we abandoned biphasic sleep, that the midnight waking period provided psychological and social benefits we no longer have access to. The deep thinking, the quiet reflection, the intimate conversations, these things had value that might have been lost in the push for continuous 8-hour sleep. On the other hand, modern sleeping arrangements are definitely more comfortable and sanitary than medieval ones. We have bug-free beds, temperature control, and the ability to sleep without worrying about demons or freezing to death. So it's not all bad. We traded one set of sleep problems for a different set, which is kind of the human story in general. Some modern sleep disorders might actually be our bodies trying to return to the old two-sleep pattern. People who consistently wake up in the middle of the night and can't get back to sleep for an hour or two might not have insomnia in the clinical sense. They might just have circadian rhythms that still expect the watching period. But in a society structured around continuous sleep, this natural pattern becomes a disorder that needs to be treated. There's been some modern interest in intentionally returning to biphasic sleep schedules, with people experimenting with sleeping in two segments. Some report that it works well for them, giving them that quiet nighttime period for creativity or reflection. Others find it just doesn't fit with modern life. Work schedules, family obligations, and social expectations all assume continuous sleep. So even if you want to sleep like a medieval person, it's hard to make it work in the 21st century. The history of sleep shows how even something as fundamental as when and how we sleep is shaped by culture, technology, economics, and social structures. Medieval people slept the way they did partly because of their material conditions, but also because of their beliefs, their work patterns, and their social organization. As those things changed, sleep patterns changed too. It makes you wonder what future historians will say about our current sleep practices. Will people 500 years from now think it was weird that we slept 8 hours straight in individual beds, in separate rooms with elaborate bedtime routines and sleep tracking apps?
Probably. Every era thinks its way of doing things is normal and natural, but really we're all just making it up as we go along, adapting to our circumstances as best we can.
Let's get into some of the really specific, weird, sleep-related practices that existed in different parts of medieval Europe, because there were fascinating regional variations in how people approached sleep. What was normal in one area would be completely foreign somewhere else. In Scandinavia and other far northern regions, the extreme seasonal variation in daylight hours created unique sleep challenges. During the summer, the sun barely set. In the far north, it didn't set at all for weeks. During winter, darkness lasted for most of the day. This meant sleep schedules varied wildly by season, even more than in other parts of Europe. People might sleep very little during the bright summer months and then basically hibernate during the dark winter. Nordic cultures had specific practices around bed sharing and sleeping arrangements. In some regions, entire families would sleep together in a single large bed platform built against the wall, with the warmest spot, farthest from the door, reserved for the most vulnerable family members. The bed might be boxed in with wooden walls on 3 sides for extra warmth. This created a cozy sleeping space, but also zero privacy. In Iceland, which was settled during the medieval period, the sleeping arrangements were particularly interesting. Icelandic houses had a central sleeping hall where everyone slept on raised platforms along the walls. The platforms had wooden dividers between sleeping spaces, giving each person or couple a little cubby. The roof was turf, providing excellent insulation, but also meaning you were basically sleeping underground. This kept people warm, but must have felt claustrophobic. In the Mediterranean regions, Italy, Spain, southern France, the climate was warmer, so sleep challenges were different from the winter. Summer heat was a bigger problem than winter cold. People might sleep outdoors on roofs or in courtyards during hot summer nights. Siestas during the hottest part of the day were common, creating a different sleep pattern where you'd sleep midday and then stay up later into the evening when it was cooler. Spanish and Italian cities had different nighttime cultures compared to Northern Europe. There was more evening socializing, more tolerance for nighttime activity, and generally later sleep times. The evening passeggiata, the social walk through town, became a tradition in Italian cities. This Mediterranean pattern of later sleeping and midday rest is still visible in modern culture and probably has medieval roots. In Eastern Europe and Russia, sleeping arrangements varied significantly from Western Europe in some ways. Russian peasants often slept on top of the stove, not literally on the cooking surface, but on a sleeping platform built above the large masonry stove that heated the home. This was the warmest spot in the house during brutal Russian winters. Multiple people would crowd onto this sleeping platform, packed together like sardines, but at least they were warm. The use of bathhouses for sleeping was a Russian practice that seems wild from a modern perspective. Public bathhouses would stay warm overnight from the heated stones used for steam. Poor people or travelers who had nowhere else to sleep might pay to spend the night in the bathhouse, sleeping on the benches in the warm, humid environment. This sounds like it would be uncomfortable and smelly, but it beat freezing to death outside. Jewish communities had specific sleep-related religious practices that differed from Christian neighbors. Jewish dietary laws affected what people ate before bed, which probably affected sleep quality. The practice of studying religious texts late into the evening was common among Jewish scholars, creating a culture of later sleeping times. Friday night into Saturday, the Sabbath, had specific rules about sleep and rest that structured the week differently than in Christian households. Muslim communities in medieval Spain, Al-Andalus, and other areas had sleep patterns influenced by Islamic prayer times. The 5 daily prayers, including the pre-dawn Fajr prayer and the evening Isha prayer, structured the day and night differently than in Christian Europe.
Muslims would go to bed after Isha prayer, sleep for a few hours, then wake up for Fajr before dawn, then potentially sleep again afterward. This created a different rhythm that wasn't quite the same as the Christian two-sleep pattern, but also wasn't continuous sleep. Islamic hygiene practices also affected sleep. Ritual washing before prayer meant Muslims were washing multiple times a day, including before bed and upon waking, which was actually way more hygienic than typical Christian practice. This probably reduced some of the skin conditions and infections that plagued people who rarely washed. Muslim regions also had different bed designs, with more emphasis on carpets and cushions rather than raised bed frames. In the Byzantine Empire, which preserved much of ancient Roman culture while being Christian, sleep practices combined classical and medieval elements. Upper-class Byzantines had elaborate bedrooms with silk sheets and fine furnishings that would have seemed impossibly luxurious to Western Europeans. The Byzantine court had complex rituals around the emperor's sleep, similar to but even more elaborate than what developed in Western royal courts. Nomadic peoples, like the Mongols, who weren't exactly European but definitely interacted with medieval Europe through invasion and trade, had completely different sleep arrangements. They slept in yurts, portable felt tents that were surprisingly comfortable and well insulated. The circular design with a fire in the center distributed heat efficiently. Multiple families might share a large yurt, or important individuals might have their own smaller ones. The mobility of nomadic life meant sleep spaces had to be portable and adaptable. In the Celtic regions, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Brittany, there were holdover practices from pre-Christian times mixed with medieval Christian practices. Some rural areas maintained traditions of sleep rituals involving pre-Christian symbols alongside Christian prayers. The belief in fairies and the fae was particularly strong in Celtic regions, affecting nighttime practices and sleep anxieties in specific ways we mentioned earlier.
Scottish Highland practices included some unique elements. The tradition of the bundling board, placing a board down the middle of a bed to separate an unmarried couple who were courting, allowed for supervised co-sleeping while maintaining propriety. Young people could lie together and talk, but were physically separated by the board. This practice existed in other regions too, but was particularly common in Scotland and later in early American colonies. Welsh folklore about sleep and dreams was particularly rich, with specific traditions about dream interpretation and prophetic sleeping. The Welsh had a practice called sleeping on a saint, sleeping in a church on a saint's feast day to deceive healing or prophetic dreams. This was done throughout Christian Europe, but was especially emphasized in Welsh religious practice. Irish monasteries had a reputation for particularly harsh sleeping conditions, even by monastic standards. Irish monks were known for extreme asceticism, sometimes sleeping on bare stone or standing upright in cold water as a form of penance. The goal was to make sleep as uncomfortable as possible to demonstrate devotion and avoid the sin of sloth. This hardcore approach influenced Irish missionary monks who travelled to continental Europe and brought these practices with them. In Germanic regions, there were specific folk beliefs about sleep that varied from village to village. Some areas believed you should always sleep with your head pointing in a certain direction, toward the altar of the local church or toward Mecca for Muslims, or away from the direction where corpses were buried. Sleeping in the wrong direction was thought to bring bad luck or nightmares. The practice of watching the dead varied by region, but was universal in some form. When someone died, family or community members would stay up all night with the body, praying and keeping vigil. This served practical purposes, making sure the person was really dead, protecting the body from animals or theft, but was primarily a religious and social duty. The vigil could last one night or several nights, depending on local custom and the status of the deceased. Alpine regions had unique challenges related to altitude and terrain. Mountain communities dealt with thinner air, more extreme weather, and isolation during winter. Some alpine villages would be completely cut off by snow for months, with everyone essentially trapped in their homes. The psychological impact of this isolation must have been intense, and sleep patterns would adapt to the enforced hibernation period. Funeral practices related to sleep varied significantly. In some regions, people believed the dead slept in their graves and would eventually wake on Judgment Day. This sleep of death metaphor was taken literally by some, leading to graves being furnished with pillows or the deceased being positioned as if sleeping. Other regions emphasized the separation between sleep and death, positioning bodies sitting up or in other non-sleeping poses. Some regions had traditions of professional sleepers, people hired to sleep in place of someone else. This sounds bizarre, but it existed. A rich person who had vowed to do some form of penance involving uncomfortable sleep might pay someone else to sleep or not sleep on their behalf. This was controversial and condemned by church authorities, but it happened anyway because medieval people loved finding loopholes in religious obligations. The tradition of sin-eaters existed in some regions, particularly in Wales and the English-Scottish border areas. A sin-eater would be paid to eat a meal placed on or near a corpse, symbolically consuming the deceased's sins so they could rest peacefully. This was sort of sleep-related in that it was about ensuring the dead could sleep in their graves rather than becoming restless spirits. The practice was considered somewhat heretical, but persisted in remote areas. Variations in bed construction were significant. In some areas, beds were built into the walls like cabinets, with doors that could close for extra warmth and privacy. These box beds, or closed beds, were common in Brittany, the Netherlands, and other regions. You'd climb in through a small opening and close the doors behind you, creating a dark, warm sleeping space. This seems claustrophobic to modern sensibilities, but was considered cosy and protective. Some regions had traditions of blessing beds and bedrooms with holy water, salt, or other protective substances. A priest might be called to bless a new bed or bedroom, especially if people were having nightmares or sleeping poorly. The ritual would involve prayers, sprinkling of holy water, and possibly leaving religious items in the room. This was considered preventative medicine against spiritual threats. The use of herbs and plants for sleep varied regionally based on what was locally available. Mediterranean regions used lavender extensively. Northern regions might use hops or valerian. Some herbs were burned as incense, others were stuffed in pillows, others were made into teas. Folk knowledge about which plants helped sleep was passed down through generations and varied significantly from place to place. Some regions had specific taboos about sleep. In certain areas, it was considered bad luck to make a bed during certain times of day or to change the bedding on specific days of the week. Sleeping with windows open versus closed was debated. Some regions thought night air was dangerous and poisonous. Others thought closed rooms were unhealthy. There was no consensus, just a patchwork of local beliefs. The practice of churching women after childbirth affected sleep patterns for new mothers. In many regions, women who had recently given birth were supposed to stay in bed and avoid normal activities for a period of time, sometimes weeks, until they could be formally churched or blessed and welcomed back to normal life. This enforced rest period probably helped with recovery, but it also isolated women and created its own problems. Regional festivals and holy days created synchronized sleep disruption. Everyone in a community would stay up together for certain celebrations, then everyone would be exhausted together the next day. These shared experiences created social bonding, but also meant entire villages would be sleep-deprived at the same times. The day after a major feast day, productivity would drop because everyone was recovering. Some regions had traditions of prophetic or oracular sleep, where people would deliberately seek visions by sleeping in specific locations or conditions. Sleeping under a certain tree, at a crossroads, or in a particular building might be thought to bring significant dreams. These practices often had pre-Christian origins that were incompletely suppressed by Christianity and continued in folk practice. The differences between urban and rural sleep patterns grew more pronounced as the medieval period progressed. City dwellers had more artificial light, more nighttime activity, more scheduled obligations that disrupted natural sleep rhythms. Rural people remained more tied to agricultural cycles and seasonal variations. This urban-rural divide in sleep patterns is still with us today, though the gap has narrowed with modern lighting and technology.
As we drift toward the end of our marathon exploration of medieval sleep, let's think about what all this tells us about human life during this period and how dramatically different our sleep experience is today compared to our ancestors. Medieval sleep wasn't just about rest. It was wrapped up in religion, social structure, survival challenges, and supernatural beliefs. Every aspect of going to bed and waking up was freighted with meaning and anxiety. Modern people complain about sleep problems, and those complaints are valid, but we don't have to worry about demons, freezing to death, being eaten by bugs, or dying of easily preventable diseases during the night. Our sleep anxieties are different and in many ways less existentially threatening. The physical discomfort of medieval sleep is hard for us to fully grasp. We're used to comfortable mattresses, climate-controlled rooms, and pest-free environments. Imagining what it was like to sleep on straw, crawling with fleas, in a freezing room surrounded by family members and possibly livestock, while being genuinely afraid of supernatural attack, it's almost impossible to put yourself in that mental and physical state. Medieval people just lived with levels of discomfort that would be intolerable to us. But they were adapted to it in ways we're not adapted to modern comfort. You can get used to almost anything if you have no choice, and medieval people had no choice. They didn't lie awake thinking, I wish I had a memory foam mattress and central heating. Those concepts didn't exist. They dealt with what they had and found ways to make the best of it. The human capacity for adaptation is remarkable. The psychological dimension of medieval sleep, the constant anxiety about supernatural threats, is perhaps even more significant than the physical discomfort. Modern people who believe in supernatural entities often find those beliefs comforting rather than frightening. Medieval people genuinely believed they were under threat every single night from forces they couldn't see or fight. That kind of ambient anxiety must have been exhausting and must have impacted mental health on a massive scale. The social aspects of medieval sleep are fascinating when you compare them to modern practices. We've become so individualistic about sleep, everyone in their own room, in their own bed, with their personal preferences catered to. Medieval people had almost no privacy, slept in groups, and had their sleep patterns determined by social and economic structures beyond their control. Neither approach is objectively better, they just reflect different values and different material conditions. The two-sleep pattern is particularly interesting because it shows how even something that seems biological and fixed, like when we sleep, is actually culturally constructed to a significant degree. The human body is flexible and will adapt to whatever schedule you impose on it. Medieval people weren't biologically different from us, they just lived in a world with different constraints and expectations, so their sleep patterns developed differently. One thing that's striking is how little sleep quality mattered in terms of social concern. Medieval sources don't show much anxiety about whether people were sleeping well or getting enough rest, except in the context of religious practice. There was no concept of sleep hygiene, no sleep medicine, no concern about optimizing sleep for health and productivity.
People slept however they slept and dealt with the consequences. The modern obsession with sleep optimization would have seemed bizarre to medieval people. But they did understand on some level that sleep was important. Folk wisdom preserved basic knowledge about sleep's restorative properties even without scientific understanding. People knew that sick people needed rest, that exhausted people made mistakes, that children needed more sleep than adults. This practical knowledge existed alongside all the supernatural beliefs and weird practices. The religious dimension of sleep is something we've largely lost in secular modern society. For medieval people, going to sleep was a spiritual act that required prayer and preparation. Sleep was a time of vulnerability when your soul needed protection. Modern people might pray before bed, but it's optional and personal, rather than a universal expectation with serious spiritual consequences. The secularization of sleep is a huge shift in how we experience what is ultimately an unavoidable part of daily life. The class dimensions of sleep inequality in medieval times were extreme, but we still have sleep inequality today, just different kinds. Poor people today might work multiple jobs and be chronically sleep-deprived, or live in loud neighborhoods where quality sleep is hard to get, or lack access to health care for sleep disorders. Rich people can buy better mattresses, quieter homes, and medical care. The specific problems differ, but inequality in sleep quality persists across historical eras. What would medieval people think of how we sleep today? They'd probably be amazed by the comfort, the cleanliness, the safety. They'd be confused by our insistence on sleeping alone in separate rooms, by our artificial lighting that extends the day, by our alarm clocks that wake us up at arbitrary times regardless of natural rhythms. They'd probably think we were weird for not praying extensively before bed, for not fearing supernatural threats, for treating sleep as something to optimize rather than endure. And what can we learn from medieval sleep practices? Maybe that our current approach isn't the only way or necessarily the best way. The two-sleep pattern might actually be more natural than forcing 8 continuous hours. The medieval practice of quiet reflection during the night watch might have psychological benefits we've lost. The stronger connection to natural day-night cycles might be healthier than our artificial schedule. There's room for questioning our assumptions about sleep. But on the other hand, I really don't recommend sleeping on straw infested with bugs or worrying about demons. Modern comfort and hygiene are genuine improvements. We don't need to romanticize medieval life. It was harsh and difficult in ways we should be grateful to have escaped. But we can acknowledge that in adapting to modernity, we may have lost some things worth reconsidering. The history of sleep is the history of human experience in miniature. It involves our biology, our beliefs, our social structures, our technology, our inequalities, our fears, and our adaptations. How we sleep reflects who we are as a culture and what we value. Medieval sleep tells us about a world that valued spiritual protection over physical comfort, community over privacy, and adaptation to nature over domination of it. As we lie here at the end of this very long exploration of medieval sleep, it's worth thinking about our own sleep habits and what they say about our world. We have incredible luxury and technology available for sleep, but many people still struggle with insomnia, sleep disorders, and exhaustion. We've solved medieval sleep problems only to create new ones. We don't freeze or get eaten by bugs, but we stare at screens before bed and disrupt our circadian rhythms. We don't fear demons, but we have different anxieties that keep us awake. Maybe the lesson is that every era has its sleep challenges, and humans have always struggled to get adequate rest while dealing with whatever environmental, social, and psychological pressures their time period throws at them. Medieval people dealt with cold, bugs, disease, and demons. We deal with stress, technology, schedules, and the peculiar loneliness of modern individualism. Different problems, same basic human need for rest and safety. And with that thought, we've reached the end of our journey through medieval sleep habits. We've covered the two-sleep pattern, the horrific bed conditions, the supernatural terrors, the regional variations, the class inequalities, the religious dimensions, and everything else weird and fascinating about how our ancestors spent their nights. It's been a long journey, appropriately enough for a video designed to help you sleep. So, as you drift off tonight in your comfortable, bug-free, temperature-controlled bedroom, maybe spare a thought for the medieval peasant shivering on their pile of straw, or the monk waking at 2 a.m. for prayers, or the noble lying in their canopy bed worrying about assassination and demons. Our ancestors survived incredible hardships, including terrible sleep conditions, and here we are as a result. Sleep well and be grateful for memory foam mattresses and central heating. They're genuinely some of humanity's greatest achievements. Thanks for watching, and if you somehow made it to the end of this while still awake, congratulations on your superhuman attention span. Go ahead and like and subscribe if you want more absurdly long history videos that nobody asked for. I'll be back with more medieval weirdness soon. Good night, sleep tight, and don't let the bedbugs bite, because unlike medieval people, you actually have a reasonable expectation of not being devoured by insects. Sweet dreams, everyone.